The United States Supreme Court has just handed down a massive 6-3 ruling that completely alters the ground rules for federal immigration enforcement and also green card holders. In a case called Blanche versus Lau, the Supreme Court just cleared the way for Border Patrol officers and agents to more freely deny standard entry to green card holders that are returning potentially from a trip abroad if they have committed a crime. Writing for the majority of the court, Justice Clarence Thomas held that the federal law does not require Border Patrol agents to meet a high evidentiary standard before denying immediate reentry into the United States. The court found that the denial can occur simply if a crime has been committed instead of a full conviction already being issued. This ruling has triggered a very fierce ideological clash on the Supreme Court, with the liberal wing of the Supreme Court justices actually writing a very fierce dissent, accusing the conservative majority of handing the government a massive blank check to upend the lives of many legal residents, they claim, and impact their current status. So today we're going to break down what this ruling did, what it said, the two fundamental distinctions and kind of legal philosophies that were at play here on the Supreme Court, and also what this means going forward. Now, before we jump into what the Supreme Court just ruled on in this case, if you like this type of content and you want to make sure you get it in the future, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and also make sure you turn on all notifications to ensure that you never miss this information when I release it. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. In my opinion, when it comes to self-defense protection, if you want the best on the market right now, I highly recommend AOR. They're an actual law firm. They're backed by self-defense attorneys that have been doing this for years, and your attorneys, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. So if you want to check them out, you can do so using the links down below. And right now, for a limited time, I believe until the end of July, if you use my exclusive code ARMSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off of the family fee. Now, to understand how this eventually reached the Supreme Court, we have to look at the underlying facts that led to this challenge. Now, the individual here, Mr. Lau, is a Chinese citizen who became a lawful permanent resident back in 2007 and got a green card. In May of 2012, Mr. Lau was charged in New Jersey with trademark counterfeiting for allegedly storing nearly, I believe, about $300,000 worth of counterfeit clothing. Now, while waiting trial, Mr. Lau took a temporary trip back to China. When he flew back into JFK after that trip, I believe that was in June of 2012, essentially he assumed that he would be able to be processed normally and enter back into the United States. Under federal immigration laws, green card holders possess a default right to be treated as already admitted into the country, and they don't have to reapply for admission every time that they return from this type of short trip. However, there are specific statutory exceptions to that general rule. A Border Patrol officer can strip the default status away if the resident has committed certain offenses, including a crime involving moral turpitude. Relying solely on the active New Jersey indictment against Mr. Lau, the Border Patrol officer declined to formally admit him into the United States. Instead, the officer confiscated his permanent green card, gave him some temporary paperwork, and essentially paroled him into the country to face prosecution. About a year later, Mr. Lau actually pled guilty to those charges in the indictment. The government then used that conviction to launch formal removal proceedings against Mr. Lau. Because of this, the individual here filed a lawsuit arguing that the Border Patrol officer actually jumped the gun. He claimed that at the moment when he was standing at the border gates there, an indictment wasn't proof that he had actually committed a crime. So like I said, he challenged this finding, and on first review, an immigration appeals court disagreed with Mr. Lau's position and ruled against him. But that then led him to file an appeal up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And on review, the Second Circuit agreed with Mr. Lau and reversed the lower court ruling against him. The Second Circuit ruled that the Border Patrol officers must possess clear and convincing evidence of a crime before stripping a resident status on the spot. And they claimed that that indictment was not enough to do that. Now, after the Second Circuit ruling, the US government then sought immediate Supreme Court review of this case. And just recently, in a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court completely vacated the Second Circuit ruling. Writing for the majority, Justice Thomas established a clear two-step framework for how the Immigration and Nationality Act should actually operate. At step one, which happens right at the border, The statute only requires the commission of the crime to justify the denying of the resident that application and the admission. At step 2, the actual conviction or formal admission of guilt is what is required later during the formal removal hearing to prove that they cannot be admitted into the United States. The core of the majority's ruling is that courts have no business reading extra words into the federal statutes that Congress chose to actually leave out. Thomas explicitly points out that the statute uses the word committed, not convicted. As the majority put it, a person does not commit a conviction. Therefore, if the border officer has a valid reason to believe that a disqualifying offense has actually occurred, such as an active criminal indictment like in this case, the law allows him to make a quick judgment on the spot and kind of make that quick call. Furthermore, the majority rejected the idea that the government must prove its case by clear and convincing evidence at the border gates themselves. Thomas noted that while the government does bear a high burden of proof at the final removal hearing, nothing in the text of the statute imposes that heavy burden on the front lines of the border on the officers themselves. The majority found that their job is maintaining security and making rapid decisions in real time, and that was too high of a burden and a standard to apply to that specific scenario. The Supreme Court found that because the individual here eventually pled guilty, the government fully satisfied its burden of proof at the actual hearing with clear and convincing evidence. Now, predictably, this interpretation faced a sharp criticism and opposition from the court's liberal wing of justices. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson authored the dissent, which was joined by Sotomayor and Kagan, and they filed a very lengthy dissent focusing heavily on due process and the presumption of innocence. In the dissent, they argued that by allowing the government to act first and justify their behavior later, potentially at a hearing, the court is completely undermining what they believe is the statutory security that green card holders are supposed to be guaranteed. In the dissent, Jackson focused on what she believes were real-world consequences, noting that when Mr. Lau was paroled, his permanent green card was confiscated, leaving him in a state of unstable immigration limbo for what she claims is over a decade. And she argued that the temporary paperwork makes it incredibly difficult for these individuals to secure housing, open bank accounts, and maintain their employment. From the position of the dissenters, they argue that due process is a foundation of America, that you're innocent until proven guilty, and she claims that this ruling by the Supreme Court flips that on its head. Ultimately, this case and decision exposes a profound divide on the Supreme Court regarding separations of power and statutory boundaries. Now, for the majority, they focus primarily on a textualist approach. They claim that this is a very straightforward case and matter, that they're simply enforcing the literal text of the statute that was passed by Congress, which gives Border Patrol officers the flexibility to make necessary spot judgments without judicial interference. However, for the dissenters, in their view, this ruling represents a troubling expansion of executive authority at the expense of individual rights, and doing this without due process in their view. So let me know your thoughts on this ruling by the Supreme Court. What do you think about Justice Thomas and the majority's strict textualist reading of this statute? Do you think that the court got this right by sticking strictly to the written text that was passed by Congress? Or do you agree potentially with the dissenters that they believe that this flips the maxim of due process on its head? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment. But as always, if you like this video and you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on all notifications to ensure that you get these videos in the future when I release them. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.